Did you know that Alzheimer's disease cannot definitively be diagnosed before death? As of right now, a 100% definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease can only be done after the individual affected has passed on. Now, of course, there are probable and possible diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but again, you cannot get a definite 100% Alzheimer's disease pre-mortem. To get a definitive diagnosis, that can only happen after death when an autopsy of the brain is done to examine it for beta amyloid plaques, which is the main, at least right now, calling card of Alzheimer's disease. Now, autopsies cannot happen while the individual is alive for very obvious reasons. Now, biopsies are kind of used sometimes, but again, they are not a definitive diagnosis and they're very invasive and also very dangerous. Now, there are ways to provide support for an Alzheimer's diagnosis that are done before the individual has passed, but again, they're not definitive. You can do cognitive evaluations such as the MMSE test, which I've talked about before, which is kind of the main one because Alzheimer's does largely affect language and memory abilities, so by doing the mini mental state exam, you can evaluate that. And stemming off of that, there has to be noticeable cognitive decline as Alzheimer's disease is progressive. So in using the MMSE exam, you have the initial score from the initial evaluation, and then they come back a good few months later to redo the test and see if there is any further cognitive decline, and if there is, that is a likely diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. However, since there are other cognitive decline diseases, such as things like Parkinson's or Huntington's, this cannot in itself provide a diagnosis. Now, as I mentioned before, you can also do MRI and CT brain scans to see if there is a decline in hippocampal volume, which I have discussed before. The hippocampus and frontal lobe of the brain tend to atrophy due to neuronal loss caused by the disease. There are also genetic evaluations you can do to see if there is any presence of the mutations in the specific genes that are associated with Alzheimer's, such as the APOE4 gene and the PSEN1 and 2 gene. However, again, genetic analysis is not always indicative because you can have these mutations and not have Alzheimer's, and then there's other things like genetic analysis as of right now is not a good definitive diagnosis. You can also do things like blood tests and lumbar punctures to see if there's any of the characteristic proteins and other stuff in there, but again, none of these are 100% definitive diagnosis. They can only lend support to a probable Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. So the only way you can get a 100% diagnosis is to do a brain autopsy to see the presence of both beta amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, which are the two, as of right now, best calling cards for a definitive diagnosis.